For years, the people who knew what happened in that studio didn't talk about it. Not because it was dangerous, because it was too difficult to explain. That is not a small distinction. Dangerous things are kept quiet out of calculation. Things that are too difficult to explain are kept quiet out of something closer to respect. A sense that the wrong words would do more damage than silence. And what happened between Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder in a Detroit recording studio in 1970 was, by the account of the few people who witnessed any part of it, something that resisted the kind of language people usually reach for when they want to describe a musical moment. It was not a collaboration in the formal sense. It was not a session that produced a finished recording, not an arrangement that ended up on an album, not a documented meeting of two creative minds that could be cited in liner notes. It was something quieter and less categorizable than any of those things, which is perhaps exactly why it stayed in the memories of the people who knew about it, long after dozens of officially documented sessions had blurred together. To understand what happened that day, you have to understand where Marvin was. The sessions for what would become What's Going On were not running smoothly in the way that Motown sessions ran smoothly. They were running differently, with a kind of loose, searching quality that made some of the people involved uneasy and others quietly certain they were witnessing something important. Marvin had been working without the usual supervision, recording in ways that departed from the label's standard procedures, following instincts that he couldn't always articulate to the people around him. He was writing towards something he could feel, but hadn't yet fully heard. That is one of the most particular kinds of artistic isolation, not the isolation of being blocked, but the isolation of being in the middle of something that only you can currently perceive, and not being entirely sure whether that perception was accurate or simply private. He had been in the studio for several days during this stretch. The musicians who came in and out described him as focused in a way that felt almost sealed, present, professional, functional, but not entirely reachable. He spoke when he needed to speak. He directed the sessions when direction was required, but the part of him that was actually working through what the album needed to be was somewhere interior, somewhere the ordinary conversation of a recording studio couldn't access. Stevie Wonder was 20 years old in 1970. He had been a Motown artist since he was 11, a child prodigy who had grown over the course of a decade into something considerably more complicated than a prodigy. He was in the middle of his own transition during this period, moving from the carefully managed pop sound of his early career toward the creative autonomy that would define his work in the following decade. He understood from his own experience what it meant to be pushing against the edges of what the system around you was willing to accommodate. He understood it not as an idea, but as a daily reality. His friendship with Marvin was one of those Motown relationships that existed partly inside the label's official structure and partly outside it, visible in the corridors and dressing rooms and shared spaces of a world they both inhabited, but also containing something more private, more specifically musical, that didn't require the presence of anyone else to sustain itself. They had played together informally. They had talked about music in the way that serious musicians talk when they're not trying to impress anyone, with the shorthand of people who share a vocabulary, who can reference a chord change or a rhythmic idea and have the other person already 3 steps ahead in the conversation. The day Stevie walked into the studio was not arranged. There was no phone call that morning, no message passed through an intermediary. He simply came. This was not by itself unusual. The studios at Hitsville had a particular quality of permeability during this period, a sense that the building belonged to everyone who worked there, that showing up was a form of participation. But the timing of this particular visit, arriving during the most inward stretch of the most interior project Marvin had ever undertaken, gave it a quality that casual appearances didn't usually carry. Marvin was at the piano when Stevie came in. Not recording, not in a formal session sense, but at the piano the way he sometimes was in the spaces between takes, working something out for himself, following a melodic idea that didn't yet have a shape he could describe. The room was otherwise mostly empty. An engineer was somewhere in the building. A musician or two may have been present for part of what followed, though the accounts differ on this point, and none of the people who were there ever spoke about it in enough detail to settle the question. Stevie sat down. Not at the piano with Marvin. There was a second keyboard in the room, a slightly different instrument, positioned at an angle that meant the two of them were not quite facing each other, but were close enough that what one played was immediately audible to the other. He didn't announce what he was going to play. He didn't ask whether Marvin minded. He simply sat down and began. What followed was not a rehearsed musical conversation. It was something closer to the kind of listening that produces sound. Two musicians responding to each other in real time, not building toward anything in particular, not trying to arrive at a product, simply following where the music went. Marvin would play something, and Stevie would find a way to exist alongside it without completing it or overwriting it. Stevie would move in a direction, and Marvin would let the space between them fill with something that wasn't exactly harmony and wasn't exactly counterpoint, something that had its own name, perhaps, in a language that didn't exist outside of that room. The people who heard any part of this, who were present for a stretch of it before quietly withdrawing, understanding that their presence was unnecessary and possibly intrusive, later described it in the careful, slightly frustrated language of witnesses who know they are failing to convey something. One person said it sounded like two people having a conversation in a language they had invented together. Another said it didn't sound like music in the way that finished music sounds like music. It sounded like the thing underneath music, the thing that music is trying to say before it decides how to say it. Neither Marvin nor Stevie said very much during this time. Occasionally, one of them would stop, and the other would continue for a few bars before also stopping, and there would be a silence that was not an uncomfortable silence, the silence of people who are thinking in the same direction and don't need words to confirm it. Then one of them would begin again. This went on for something between 40 minutes and an hour. The accounts differ on the exact duration, which is itself a kind of testimony. Time moves differently in rooms where something real is happening. When it ended the way it had begun, without announcement. Stevie stood up from the keyboard, said something brief to Marvin. The exact words were not recorded or remembered precisely by anyone who heard them, and left the studio the way he had entered it, without ceremony. Marvin sat at the piano for a while after he was gone. What happened in the sessions that followed, in the days and weeks after that afternoon, was not dramatically different from what had been happening before. The album continued its slow, searching progress. The songs took shape the way they had been taking shape. There was no specific track that could be pointed to afterward and identified as the direct product of that afternoon's piano conversation. The connection was not that simple or that traceable. But the musicians who worked with Marvin in the period after that visit would later describe him as subtly changed. Not in any way that was easy to name, not more talkative, not more decisive, not more or less anything in the ways that people usually measure change in another person. More settled, perhaps, as if something that had been held slightly apart from itself had for an afternoon been allowed to be whole and had not entirely gone back to the way it was before. The reason people who knew about it didn't explain it was not that they were protecting a secret. It was that they had tried on various occasions to explain it and found that their explanations were worse than saying nothing. The words available, collaboration, influence, inspiration, connection, were all accurate in a technical sense and all inadequate in the sense that mattered. Something had happened in that room between two musicians who understood each other in a way that most people never find with another person, musical or otherwise. And the only honest account of it was that it had happened and that it had mattered, and that the full shape of why it mattered was something that lived in the music itself, in the album that Marvin finished, in the records that Stevie would make in the years that followed, rather than in any story that could be told about a particular afternoon in a Detroit studio. What's Going On was released in 1971. It would become, in the years and decades that followed, one of the most discussed and celebrated records in the history of American music. People would write at length about its origins, its recording sessions, its political context, its spiritual weight. Scholars would analyze its structure. Critics would place it at the top of lists. Artists across generations would name it as a record that changed what they thought music could do. Almost none of those accounts mentioned the afternoon in the studio. Not because it wasn't known. A small number of people had always known about it, in the way that small, true things are known, quietly, without documentation, in the memories of the people who were there. But because the people who knew had always struggled to put it in terms that did the moment justice. And so they had said other things instead, had talked about the musicians, the engineers, the recording techniques, the social context, and had left the afternoon in the studio where it had always been, in the room, with the two men, and the two keyboards, and the particular silence that came after. What Stevie Wonder gave Marvin Gaye that afternoon was not a melody or a lyric or a technique. It was the presence of someone who could hear what he was doing clearly enough to sit beside it, not to improve it, not to complete it, but simply to be there with it in a way that confirmed, without words, that the music was real, that it existed outside of Marvin's own perception, that someone else could enter the room it came from and find their way around inside it. That is a rarer gift than it sounds in a life in music. Most musicians spend their careers searching for it. Marvin found it that afternoon in a studio in Detroit in 1970, when a 20-year-old with sunglasses sat down at a keyboard and simply began to play. For years, the people who knew didn't talk about it, not because it was dangerous, because some things are better heard than explained.